Hello, everyone. My name is Joey Shore. I'm the lead engineer on the Quay team at CoreOS, and I'm here today to talk about Quay and Quay Enterprise, our enterprise-grade container registry product. This is going to be a pretty free-form webinar. If you have any questions during the duration, please ask, and I will be happy to answer. As well, most of my demo today will occur on Quay.io, which is our SaaS offering of Quay Enterprise. It is actually a Quay Enterprise running on Amazon Cloud that we manage. So if you'd like, you can sign up for a free account now and follow along as I do some of the demos today. To get started, I'm going to just give a brief background of what a registry is, what Quay does, and then I will dive in and show how you can use it to operate your containerized infrastructure. So getting started, Quay is a enterprise-grade registry product. As I said, it runs both in SaaS as Quay.io and on premises as Quay Enterprise. It's the same piece of software, and it allows you to manage all of your Docker images that you can push and pull, as well as things such as building images and the security around them, which I will demonstrate today. So to get started, I have an account I've already created here, which you can see is called Quay Webinar, and I'm going to simply log in to Quay.io, and I'm going to use my Quay Webinar account and my password that I created, and I've logged in. So just like the normal Docker Hub or any other registry, you can just log into it using the DNS name. I'm going to create a very simple container image that I can use as an example. So I'm going to run a BusyBox here, which I will download, and I'm going to create a shell, and I'm going to add a simple echo command into it. Foo to bar, just so I have an image, exit, PSA. I'm going to commit my image that I just created to Quay.io, Quay Webinar namespace, and I'll call it test image, and I will push it. So you can see immediately that the workflow is the same for working with Quay as any other Docker registry. I was able to just create a simple image, tag it, push it, and it's now been pushed. And if I go back to the Quay UI here and reload, we'll see that my repository was created. For security reasons, all repositories created in Quay Enterprise are private by default, so you don't end up in a situation where you can accidentally push a public image. If I jump into my repository here, we'll see the repository UI. This is actually like the heart and soul of the Quay product. It's where each individual repository is tagged and its images are managed. And it's where most developers or people interacting will spend their time. At the overview screen, you can see the repository activity. This shows the level of activity on the repository. Since I've just created my repository, I of course have no activity. Recent repository builds. This shows the current builds that have occurred on the repo, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I can star the repository if I want it to be, my favorite one, in which case it will show up at the top of my repositories list here as starred. As well, I can see it set a description. This includes full markdown. So if I want to say this is the best, I gotta actually type it, best repo, I can save the changes and it will show up there. And then there are very simple commands for following it. Moving on to the repository tags view. This shows all the tags that exist in the repository. Here we can see my latest tag that I just created a moment ago. We can see that the tag has been queued for security scanning, something I will discuss in a minute. We can see the size of my image, when it expires, something I'll also discuss in a minute, as well as the image. I can deep dive into the image view, actually see the history of my layers. So here you can see I ran a shell and then I added a file, in this case that foo command. And then I can also, going back, I can do things such as download this tag via Docker or a few other formats. So being a registry, our primary purpose, of course, is storing images, but we provide a lot of tooling around those images, which makes Quay fairly unique amongst the registry products. For example, we provide something we call Time Machine. So as we can see here, I have an additional tab here called Tag History, which will track the full history of my tag. In this case, I just pushed this latest tag. However, let's say I were to go here and create another image, echo bar to Boz. exit, and commit it to the same tag that I did before. Oops, gotta actually put the ID there. So I will do that and push that image to Quay. Now, normally on most registry products, what this will do is simply overwrite the tag and that's it. You only have the current version of that tag available. But let's say you're running a production containerized environment and someone pushes a bad image and now your production is broken. Well, what do? For most registry products, you'd have to go rebuild the image, re-push it, and hope that you'll get the same version. Quay, however, has a feature we call Time Machine, and as we can see here, we keep the history of the tags. So you can see I have the previous version of the tag, latest, was created pointing to this particular image at the, a couple of minutes ago, and then right now it was moved from the previous image to this current image. And in fact, if I'd like, I can actually revert the tag back to the previous version of the image, which I will actually do. I will restore. And now you can see it's been reverted. So now my tag is back at the previous version of the image, and anyone who were to pull the image via Docker pull command here would actually get a previous version of that image. This is a fairly unique feature, as I said, and it allows people who are managing repositories in Quay to have confidence that even if they accidentally push a tag or say go here and delete that tag, which I'm going to do, you can also just decide to restore it back to where it was, and it will show back up as being undeleted, and it will be back here again in the history. Likewise, as part of this time machine feature, we have something called expiration. So let's say I have this latest tag and I wish it to expire tomorrow. I can set the expiration on it, and once the expiration date passes tomorrow afternoon, the tag will automatically be expired, but will still be available within Time Machine until such time as I decide to either revert it or push a new tag. Now, let's say I decide to push my tag again, just to get it back to the state I had before. Reload. In addition to the Time Machine feature, one of the other unique features that we provide in Quay is our security scan feature. So you can see here that the tag that I just pushed is now queued for security scan. It'll take a few minutes for a security scanner to come up. Just to speed up the demo, I'll go to one of our other images here that I know has a large amount of security holes in it, just to show a fun little security. So as you can see here, the security scan column shows an overview of the most pressing vulnerabilities, as well as which ones are fixable. This is fairly unique to Quay. It's due to an integration with an open source project we've created called Claire, which you can find on github.com/CoreOS/Claire. And we now are able to present not only the vulnerabilities that your image contains, but whether there's actionable intelligence that you can actually take. In other words, items that you can fix within that image. So if I were to deep dive into the security scan view here, you can see I get this really nice graph overview. It shows the number of vulnerabilities detected in this image, in this case 473. This is why we keep this image around, because it's a really good demo of large amounts of vulnerabilities. We can see that patches are available for 380 of them, so probably a good idea to patch it. We see a breakdown of the severity of those vulnerabilities. So here we can see there are 16 high-level ones. That's pretty important to fix. 247 medium ones, still pretty important. And then quite a few low-level or negligible level vulnerabilities, which we probably should fix if we can, but if we don't, probably not super important. While the overview is very nice, being able to actually see the details of what the vulnerabilities are is also very critical. So if I scroll down here, you'll see I get a detailed report indicative of all the vulnerabilities that are found in this image. So for example, I can see that it's by default sorted by severity. In this case, we can see there's a severity 10 out of 10. That's pretty important. It's in bash. We see that it exists in this particular package, in this case, version 4.3-7 of Ubuntu, and is in fact fixed in bash version 4.3.7 Ubuntu 1.1. Now, if I want more details on the CVE, I can either click this little link to go to the actual page on the distro, in this case on Ubuntu, or I can just open up the vulnerability report. And here I get individual breakdowns of all of the possibilities of how this vulnerability can be used, its access vector, how hard it is to do, whether it requires authentication, how it implements confidentiality of private information, and the integrity of their systems. We provide tool tipping over each of these areas to explain what it means in detail. In this case, we can see we have the worst levels at all 5 vectors, which is why this is rated 10 out of 10. And in fact, we can see the description, which shows that this is in fact the shell shock vulnerability that came out a few years ago, which is of course a major critical level vulnerability that we found in a bunch of systems. And in fact, using Quay's security scanner, we were able to detect a large number of images very quickly for our customers so that they knew that they were vulnerable to shell shock. A few other important pieces of information shown here, in addition to the fixed-in version, which is unique to the Quay integrated security scanner. You can see which image in the overall image introduced this vulnerability, which layer. You can actually click this little icon to go to that image itself. And if you just want to be cognizant of the images that, the vulnerabilities that need to be fixed, you can just show only the fixable vulnerabilities here. You can also just filter these out, so I can say, oh, only give me the ones that affect Bash. And as we can see here, there are, even just for Bash and even for only the ones that are fixable, we're still looking at 9 vulnerabilities, which is quite a bit. So this is our security scanning feature. On top of this report, we also provide a supplemental report called the packages view. This provides a list of all of the recognized packages, whether vulnerable or not, in the image. As we can see here, 64% or 96 of the recognized 151 packages have no vulnerabilities, which is great. But we can see that 8 packages have high level ones, 36 have medium, and a few others. So we can see here that upgrading is almost certainly important. And if we scroll down, we can see a similar table to the previous view. This shows all of our packages, their names, what version they are, what vulnerabilities they contain. This is a critical column. The remaining after upgrade shows how many vulnerabilities will remain after we upgrade to the latest version of that package. This is pretty important because if you upgrade a single package, you want to know if there's going to be anything remaining. So for a good example here, eglibc has 4 high and 39 additional vulnerabilities, but if I upgrade, I'll still have 1 high. So I might want to upgrade and then take a look at what that additional vulnerability is and perhaps remediate it in a different manner. As we can see here, this view is actually sorted by a metric that we've created called upgrade impact, and it lists the packages that have the most oomph, for lack of a better term, when upgraded to remediate and reduce vulnerability. So in this case, we can see if we upgrade OpenSSL, we go from 3 high and 65 additional vulnerabilities to none. So that tells me that if I only have a short period of time to upgrade my packages in my image, that I should address these few packages immediately because I will get the quote unquote biggest security bang for the buck right there by just upgrading these packages versus as I scroll down, you get to the point where say upgrading these packages has no impact or a negligible impact at least. One other key aspect of our security scanning utility is our ability to notify you when there's a vulnerability. So if I go down to the repository settings and go to events and notifications, I can create a new notification. Quay has a very rich notification system. As you can see here, we support notifications when there's been a push of any tag to the repository, a slew of different events on builds, of which I will discuss shortly. And critically for this feature, the package vulnerability found. So if I choose this event, I can choose a severity minimum, everything from unknown, which means every vulnerability, all the way up to a special level we call DEFCON 1, which is a manually curated list. If you run Quay Enterprise, your system or security administrators can manually set DEFCON 1 on vulnerabilities that they deem super critical. In addition to a special notification level, it will show a red banner at the top of the page and a red banner at the top of the repository. But let's say I want to only be notified for high vulnerabilities or higher, then I can issue a notification to one of a slew of notification means. I can issue a Quay notification, which will show up as part of this little bell up here. I can send an email. I can issue a webhook post. So let's say you want to have an automated system come along if it detects a vulnerability inside of an image and say rebuild it. You can issue a webhook post. And then there's a number of integrations with existing chat ops tools, such as Slack. So as a little bit of example of the story of this, we had a test repository that I had set up right after we launched this feature, and then I was on a plane, and I had set up a notification that if there was ever a high or critical vulnerability found in my image, to issue a Slack notification. And while I was flying, a new vulnerability in libping had been discovered that allowed for basically takeover of the container. And I received a Slack notification on my phone because I was connected to the internet on the plane saying your image is now vulnerable to this critical vulnerability. Perhaps you should have it fixed. Now, thankfully, that wasn't a production image, but had it been one, I would have immediately gone to my on-call and said, you should probably fix this image and deploy a fix accordingly. And what's really fascinating and particularly useful about our notification system is these notifications will actually get fired off not only for new images as they are pushed to Quay, but even if an existing image has a newly discovered vulnerability or a vulnerability jumps in severity. So going back to one of my previous examples, which was shell shock, when shell shock originally came out, I believe it was shell shock, the severity was not considered as severe as we ended up determining it. And I believe it was originally classified as medium level severity. So even if you had had a package vulnerability found registered as high, you would not have received a notification. At some point, the decision was made wisely to raise that severity from medium to critical. At that point, Quay issued notifications to all repository owners who had had a package vulnerability found notification set up at high, saying this vulnerability level has changed on all of these tags and has now gone from medium to critical. And since you have registered a notification for this level, the severity level, we are now letting you know. So not only are you notified for new images and not even for new vulnerabilities, but even for vulnerabilities that have been updated. Are there any questions around the security scanning before I move on? Alrighty. So in addition to our security scanning apparatus, Quay provides a number of other features that we have built in to provide for helping with the flow of setting up an image. So for a lot of users, instead of doing Docker run and then a Docker commit and then a Docker push, they will create a Docker file. A Docker file, for those who may not know, is a set of commands, which you can see here on my screen now. I will actually make it bigger in case it's hard for people to see. And a Docker file says, from some base image, run a bunch of commands, and then build an image for that. Now, this is really good because it allows for reproducible, documented means of creating a container image. And it is, in fact, our recommendation for most people who are working in a containerized workflow to make use of a Docker file or some other form of build system so that they have this reproducible, documented, ideally version-controlled description of their container image. And in fact, since we recommend people keep these files in version control, Quay has built-in support for building container images in response to version control events. So if I go to this build tabs here, you can see I don't have any builds in my history, and I don't have any build triggers registered. To start, I'm going to create a build trigger. Quay supports GitHub and GitHub Enterprise, Bitbucket, GitLab, and GitLab Enterprise, as well as something we call custom Git, which is if you have a Git repository in some other system that may not be supported natively by Quay Enterprise, you can still create a custom Git repository and hit us with a webhook, and we will just do a Git checkout of your repository at whichever revision you tell us. And so we can support any Git compatible repository. So I'm going to create a GitHub repository push trigger, and I'm going to wait for it to load. It's retrieving my organizations. You can see here I get a nice UI that says these are my organizations. So first I'm going to choose my own, because that's where my repository lives. I'm going to wait for it to retrieve the repositories. You can see here this is a nice wizard-like flow for choosing how to set up a trigger. I'm going to uncheck hide stale repositories, and I'm going to choose my test shop that I just showed you. Continue. Now I'm going to say I want it to trigger for all branches and tags. This is the default. So every time a push occurs in that Git repo, whether it be a new branch or a new tag, Quay will build it. Alternatively, I could say I want it to only occur for, say, heads/master, in which case you can see here it will only match master. I could also do tag/test tag, in which case it'll also match just for that. Of course, I have to spell it correctly. You get this nice UI showing which ones are matching, which ones are not, based on the actual branches and tags that were found in your repository. But for now, I'm going to choose everything. You choose which Docker file you want to build. You can see here we've pre-filled in the list. In this case, there's only one in the repository, but we support multiple Docker files. So I'm going to choose my Docker file. Then you select the build context. I'm just going to choose the root directory because that's where my stuff is. We would support, you can choose an optional robot account. I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. But basically, if you have a Docker file that pulls from a private base image, you need to grant access explicitly to a robot account in Quay to do that pull because we value security by default. And so you have to give us explicit permission to allow one build to pull from another repository. And then I'm ready to go. So I'm going to hit continue. It's going to set up my build trigger. This is actually set up a trigger on GitHub. So now if I go back to my GitHub here and I hit edit, and I'm going to change this from foo 126 to foo 127. I'm going to call this update 127 and then commit it. Now, if I refresh this page, we should see a build show up, and here we can see my build. So as a result of a change to like my GitHub repo, either a push or by editing in UI, I can now see that I have a build. Now this build history is pretty detailed. As we can see here, we see the description that I just entered, update 127. If I click it, it will actually take me back to the commit that I just made, which is really nice for history. I can also see, once I bring it back up, I can also see who authored it. It was offered a few seconds ago. And if I hover over, we can see it was at 1:23 p.m., which was a few seconds ago, by me. So this is my GitHub username. And in fact, if I were to click on it, I can bring up my GitHub profile. I can see which commit it was. And if clicking that would bring me to that commit, as well as which branch, in which case you can see this was branch master. Now we show the recent builds by default. We can also see the builds for the last 48 hours or the last 30 days. Of course, since I have only a single build in this repository right now, there isn't any additional history. If we dive into the build here itself, we'll see the logs. So you can see here that right now it's in the preparing build node state, and now my build is actually started. So right now it's pulling the base image. In this case, it was Ubuntu, and we'll wait for it to do so. So this is actually running on a build node, and it is isolated the build to that build node so that that build can run as root, which is required by Docker, but it is otherwise unable to access anything else. One unique aspect that I should mention here is the mention of cached images and priming the cache. Quay is unique in that we support caching for all of our builds. So when we build an image, we actually look in the entire repository history for another tag that may be matching for caching. And if so, we pull it down to the build node. This is different from most build systems that are integrated with existing Docker registries, which only use the cache on the local machine. So if you build an image that may have a cache from a few hours ago, it may have already been pushed out of the cache and you will have to rebuild those steps. On the other hand, on Quay, if I were to build an image, even if this image has a tag that could be used for cache from years ago, it will still be pulled down into the build node for caching, which means that you get caching far more often on the Quay build system than you otherwise would. So scrolling down here, we can see that my image has started building. And so actually it just finished building, so now it's pushing. But if I want to, I can open up each step and look at the logs. So you can see here are the various steps. If I go to my apt-get, we can see all of the apt-get update logs here. So we get full logs for our builds. If we go to install, same idea. These build logs actually support full color coding. So you can see here, this was output in red by apt-get, and it shows up in red in the logs. Likewise, I can see the time code for each of these logs on the right-hand side, so you can see exactly when these were built. Scrolling down. We support multi-step builds, so you can see here that I have a Docker file that had two phases. So Quay helpfully put a line to separate those phases. And once the image was built, it was pushed to my repository. So if I go back up here and go back to my image, we can now see the build completed, and I look at my tag, and now we can see that my tag has actually been pushed. And in fact, it's pushed 2 tags. This is also another unique feature of Quay. The tags that get pushed are named after the branch or Git tag that created the commit. So in this case, master. But because master was the default branch of my Git repository, I also got the latest tag updated for me automatically. And as we can see here on the right-hand side, because this is in fact the same image, we have this nice blue track here that shows that these are in fact the same image, even though they have different manifest shots. And I can at any point go and say, hey, select all of those and perform operations on them accordingly. And if we go to our tag history, we can see latest was moved again, and this new master tag was created. So I have my whole history, even just from the demo here, showing everything that I've done. So that's our build system. In addition to the build history, as we saw, which is right here, and one which keeps our logs permanently once they've loaded. We also, as I said, support different forms of notifications on our builds. So as I said, we support notifications for when the build is queued initially. So this is when GitHub or another Git provider would send us the request when the build is started. So if you have multiple builds in a repository, it may get queued, but it'll be started a few minutes later. When it's successfully completed or when it's failed. If a build has been canceled, then we also support a different kind of event for that. Personally, just speaking for our team, Quay Enterprise is actually built by Quay.io, which is of course just a Quay Enterprise. And we have success and failure build notifications that go into our Slack. And then we deploy Quay.io off of our own Quay.io. So Quay actually builds, runs, and deploys itself, which is actually really cool. Cool. Are there any questions so far? Looks like there's a question. I'm going to read it out. Now in my production system, I want to use Quay.io as build server and image repository as well. Currently, the only integration that I see with Quay.io is with Dockerfile without any extra arguments. Any idea when Quay will be coming out with these features? So we are working on supporting for build args, which we'll probably support using some form of manifest, which will be found inside of the GitHub repository, or Git repository, I should say, and or on the build trigger support. It is on our roadmap for the upcoming quarters. I can't give you a hard commit on that, but my hope is we'll have it done by the middle of the year. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. There's another part of the question. Also, I want to use Quay with my Node.js Kubot to check the build status for the last commit. But when looking at the Swagger API, the process seems to be very complicated. Are we going to go over the API usage in this webinar? I'm not going to go into details of the API usage, but this is a good segue just to discuss it briefly. Quay does support a full REST API for every operation seen in the Quay UI. In fact, every operation that I've been executing so far in this demo has been done by calling our API. For those who are interested, you can find our documentation at docs.quay.io/API. And if you go click the API Explorer link found right here, which will take a second to load, it is fetching our discovery document. You can see every single API endpoint here. Speaking specifically to the question, we do have under our repository build API, which I believe is right here. You can get the list of all of the builds for a repository. In order to do so, you do need to be OAuth'd over to Quay, and this will return all of the builds. You can then select the top build if you like and call the status API to get the particular status of that API. In addition to having the full API here, Quay does support creating OAuth applications, which other applications can then register against. I will go into that in a minute once I start discussing organizations. So that's the build. Now, it's very important to note that on top of all of these features, Quay puts a very high priority on permissions and ACLs. And this is very critical because ultimately, when it comes down to it, these container images are going to store sensitive code or other data. Although we don't recommend generally storing secrets in container images, there's still going to be IP in there. And so Quay has a very, very fine-grained permissions model. To get started, we support on the repository a variety of different forms of permissions. So you can see here, right now my repository only has one user permission, which is myself, and I am an administrator. I can also grant access to another user. So let's say I wanted to give access to my own personal user on Quay.io. I could choose myself, and I can grant read, write, or admin access. If I grant read-only access, then the user will be able to see the repository and pull it, but they will not be able to affect any changes. They will not be able to start builds. If they have write access, they can view the repo, they can pull, they can push to it, and they can kick off builds. And an administrator, which is what I am right now, will also be able to perform any action on the repository like I've been showing in the demo. However, there are a lot of times when you don't want to grant users access to your repository. There are times when you want to grant systems access to your repository. For example, you might have a CI/CD pipeline outside of Quay that you want to grant access to push images in. Likewise, you might have a production fleet that you only want to be able to pull, and you don't want to store your users' credentials necessarily on that production cluster. To meet that need, we have something called robot accounts. This is fairly unique to Quay. I can create a robot account, and let's say I can call it my prod. So I'll create my robot account, and I'll grant it read-only access. So now I have this robot called Quay Webinar plus prod. It only has read access, and this account is essentially a named token. If I click on it, I can actually see this is the token for that robot. So you can see here the username is Quay Webinar plus prod, and the password is this token. So if I were to do a Docker login with this information, I would then be able to only pull this repository. Likewise, let's say this token for some reason ended up on a system that we thought may have been compromised. At any point, I can just click this regenerate token link. And if I really want to regenerate it, I can just click regenerate token now. And now the token has been changed, and all existing uses of the token are now invalid. And I can download this token in a variety of formats, including Docker login, Kubernetes secret, Mesos credentials. This just provides a nice UI for downloading it in a faster way than having to craft it yourself. So those are our robot tokens. As I said, fairly unique to Quay. They can be managed at the namespace level. But what happens if you want to share permissions on a repository with multiple people, but you don't want to necessarily have to put every individual inside of the repository permissions for every single repository? And for that, we support something we call organizations. So we can see here, I am the user Quay Webinar, but I've also created a Quay Webinar organization. So by creating an organization, I created another namespace. And unlike my personal namespace, I actually have something called teams. So you can see here, my organization right now only has one team. It's owners. And it has just me as a member, and it has administrative roles. So let's say I wanted to create a new team and call them developers, right? And I wanted to have it just have member permission. They don't get to create anything new. I can go into the developer team and I can add users. So let's say I want to add myself, my username from before. So now I've been invited to the team or added to the team. I can also type in an email address, in which case it will invite that user. I'm not going to do that here because I don't want to send out an email, but I can type any email address I want and add it to the team. Robots can also be added to this team. So let's say I had my, dev robot, which I'll call devbot. Now the devbot is in the team. And if I end up having a repository under here, let's say I create a new repository and I choose my organization, test repo. I'm going to create it as public. Create my public repository. I can then under my permissions grant access to not only individual users but my developers team. So let's say I want my developers team to have read-write permissions on here. Now the developer team actually has permission on this repository, and since they have write permission, any member of the developer team can push and pull to this repository at any time, so long as this permission is here. So this allows you to set permissions at an organizational level and manage it individually. Now, on Quay Enterprise, we generally recommend, since the entire Quay Enterprise is for your organization, generally speaking, that organizations be treated like business units. And individual developers or individual members can be members of multiple organizations. I myself, my personal account, I'm a member of 5 or 6 organizations, and that way you can have individuals that work across business units. Each business unit can manage its own permissions model in whatever way they see fit. One other thing I should mention on our permissions in the ACL model is our concept of OAuth applications. So if I go back to my organization here, right here, and I go down to this applications tab, I can define an OAuth application, and I'm going to call it foobar. And now that I've defined this application, since Quay speaks OAuth, I can fill in the basic config, including the name, the redirect, callback URI. I have a client ID and a client secret. And so any application that speaks OAuth 2 can be registered here, and then can request from the user via the standard OAuth flow permissions on behalf of that user. And if they request such permissions such as repository read or even repository write, using a special username, they can actually, using the generated OAuth token, push and pull to those users' repositories. They can kick off builds. They can manage basically any API call that the user can perform in the UI, that application can do on their behalf. So this is also really good for writing integrations with Quay Enterprise. Let's say you have an internal orchestration tool that you want to work with Quay Enterprise, and you want it to be able to use the existing user's credentials, you can do so. Likewise, on the Quay Enterprise side, we also support the ability to log in via OIDC. So if I go under our configuration, I can actually configure different forms of authentication. I can configure LDAP, Keystone, or some form of token. I can also specify I want to use GitHub or GitHub Enterprise, Google Enterprise, or as you can see here, I have a Tectonic OIDC configured against a DEX. So we're using Tectonic identity. So if you use our enterprise-grade Kubernetes product Tectonic, you can have Quay Enterprise automatically use the same authentication system. This can also be used for things like Ping Federate, which is another popular choice. And finally, on the permissions and ACL side, I should mention Quay has a very, very fine-grained auditing system built in. Every single action in Quay is recorded. So if I click on the usage logs tab here under the under the organization, we can see all of the actions that I took even today just during the webinar. I get a nice graph at the top here showing the different kinds of operations. And then down here in the logs field, I can see I created a team, and you can see I was the one who did it, when I did it, what my IP address was when I did so. Likewise, I added a member, created a robot account, and these kind of logs are available on the organization. They're also available on the repository. So if I go to the repo, we can see I did a push, I changed the description, I did another push. We also can see that I did some reversions, deleted, I set expirations, I set up a build trigger, I built the image. We can even see the pull of the tag by the build worker. So we can see here, these operations were actually performed automatically in the repository by the repository build system. So if that, even those are logged and indicative as the build system, and I've changed some other permissions. And this is also done at the entire registry level. So if you're a super user in Quay Enterprise, you can go to the usage logs tab here, and you can actually see every single log that would show up for the entire repository. Yeah, so that's our fine-grained permissions in API model. Ultimately, there's a lot more I can discuss here in Quay. It's a very, very featureful product, from everything from supporting Helm charts in the applications tab via the Apper plugin, to the ability to explore around using the Explorer tab, to the ability to pull squashed images. There's a lot to discuss here. I'm going to briefly discuss, because this is a Quay Enterprise discussion, some additional enterprise features, and then I'm going to reserve a minute or two for additional questions. But if you have any questions, please start putting them in now. That way I can gauge my final few minutes worth of time. So in addition to all the features I've shown on Quay.io, Quay Enterprise has a few additional features, of course, because you're running it on-prem. We support the ability to specify exactly how Time Machine is configured. You can specify what the allowed expiration periods are for Time Machine, if any, the default, and whether users are able to even set expirations. You could turn off Time Machine, you could make it specific. We support something we call geo-replicated storage. This is pretty critical if you're running on multiple regions. Traditionally, what most customers will do is they will have a separate registry instance in every region, but then you have to do some sort of replicated syncing between them. This results in consistency problems of, let's say I push the latest tag for repo foobar in one region, and then my colleague pushes the latest tag for that same repository in a different region at the same time. Who wins? Instead, Quay supports running in a multi-region mode where you can run the same Quay cluster across multiple regions, and then for performance, we will actually replicate storage between those regions so that if a user in, say, New York pushes a tag and a user in LA pulls it, if the tag is available in LA storage, they'll get the LA copy. But if it's only available in New York, they'll get the New York copy. Slower, but they will get, it's fully consistent at all times. So geo-replication is a big win feature. We support, as I said, our security scanner, which you can run locally. We support app registry. This is a pretty interesting feature that we support, which is using BitTorrent to download images. So using our custom CLI tooling, you can actually download images via BitTorrent, which is a big performance win if you're pulling clusters across the planet and you want the nodes in the cluster to share. We also support, various forms of authentication, LDAP, Keystone, various forms of OIDC, as I mentioned, and then very, very specific and fine-grained feature flags around, how you can log in, whether invites are required to log in, whether encrypted passwords are required, which is a Quay-only feature, whether team invitations are necessary, our build system, things like that. Any other questions? Alrighty then. If there are no further questions, then I thank you for attending today and watching. If you have any further questions or follow-up, please don't hesitate to email our email address, which is at info@coreos.com. If you have any support questions, support@quay.io. Also for Quay Enterprise sales information and pricing information, you can email either of them. And if you have any feature requests or other interesting tidbits, feel free to send them our way. We'll be happy to respond. Again, we thank you for attending and have a great day.